June 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the story of its end was just beginning to unfold in the most unexpected ways. Across the Atlantic Ocean, military transport ships cut through dark waters, their hulls packed with thousands of men who had surrendered but refused to accept defeat in their hearts. They were German soldiers, veterans of Rommel's legendary Africa Corps, captured in the scorching sands of Tunisia in May 1943, when over 275,000 Axis troops laid down their weapons. Others had fallen into Allied hands in France in the catastrophic Ruhr pocket of April 1945, where more than 317,000 German soldiers were encircled and captured in the largest single surrender on the Western Front. Still others had been taken prisoner in the Italian mountains, their dreams of Nazi conquest crumbling with every Allied advance. Now they were being shipped to America, to camps in Kansas, Texas, Iowa, Mississippi, and beyond. As the ships approached American shores, these men stood on deck, their uniforms hanging loose from weeks of reduced rations, dust still clinging to their boots from distant battlefields. Yet, despite everything, despite the surrender, despite the defeat, arrogance lingered among them like a stubborn ghost that refused to be exorcised. Whispers in the hold. In the cramped holds of the Liberty ships, conversations circulated with the persistence of propaganda. These vessels, produced at the staggering rate of 3 per day at peak American industrial output, were returning from Europe after delivering supplies to the front lines. Rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo, enemy prisoners by the thousands. A lieutenant from Hamburg, his Luftwaffe insignia still visible on his worn jacket, stood among a group of fellow officers as rumors spread about what awaited them in America. Word had filtered through the ranks that the Americans would feed them in something called a cafeteria. Laughter erupted at the very mention of the word. "Cafeteria," the lieutenant sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Such a word could only mean a cheap tavern or a school child's lunchroom. Americans know nothing of table ritual. Their meals are as childish as their films, noisy, cheap, and tasteless. His comrades nodded in agreement, adding their own observations to the growing chorus of disdain. "Only in Germany is dining treated as an art," declared a captain from Bavaria, his voice carrying the weight of Prussian certainty. "Even in wartime we preserve dignity at the table. These Americans, they understand nothing of such refinement." The irony of their words was lost on them, a bitter irony that would soon become painfully apparent. Many of these men had not eaten a full meal in months. Bread had been scarce across Germany, potatoes strictly rationed, meat almost entirely absent from their plates. German civilian rations had plummeted to as low as 1,200 calories per day by 1945, barely enough to sustain life. Yet pride, that most dangerous of human traits, was stronger than hunger. In the darkness of the ship's hold, as the vessels churned through Atlantic waters, the German prisoners clung to memories that felt more real than the present. They remembered oak-paneled officer mess halls where white tablecloths had once been laid with ceremonial precision. They recalled sausages arranged neatly on plates, wine bottles opened with the solemnity of religious ritual. It was less about the food itself than about the performance, the carefully orchestrated theater of hierarchy displayed at every meal. To these men, dining meant order, discipline, and identity. The senior officer was always seated first. Hands were folded before eating. Measured portions of cabbage and sausage were served with military precision. Sometimes, if fortune smiled, there was even a small ration of wine. They remembered the sharp clatter of boots across polished floors, the smell of tobacco curling in the air, and the enforced silence that lasted until the ranking officer lifted his fork to signal that eating could commence. These rituals had been drilled into them as thoroughly as any military formation. For the Africa Corps veterans, the memories were even more precious. Under Rommel's command in the desert, they had faced British forces with determination and skill. Even when supplies ran low, when they subsisted on necrot, hard, crisp wheat crackers, and brackish water, they had maintained their sense of German superiority. "We were told Americans were weak," muttered a young private from Bremen, staring at the riveted steel ceiling of the ship's hold. "Decadent, obsessed with comfort and luxury. We were told they could never match German discipline, German efficiency, German culture." A sergeant nodded slowly in the darkness. "And we believed it. Why shouldn't we? Our officers, our teachers, our leaders, all of them said the same thing. America was a mongrel nation, they told us, a collection of immigrants with no true identity, no real strength. These beliefs had been systematically cultivated by Nazi propaganda for years. The prisoners genuinely believed that German meals, even the meager wartime rations they had recently endured, were sophisticated reflections of a superior culture. They imagined that American dining habits were crude and barbaric, lacking any sense of proper etiquette or refinement. But even before they reached American soil, cracks had begun to appear in their certainty. The meals served aboard the Liberty ships themselves had been unexpected. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division in Tunisia, wrote in a letter that would later reach his mother, "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration." The transatlantic crossing provided further evidence that challenged everything they had been taught. Breakfast aboard ship included oatmeal with sugar and milk, white bread with butter, and coffee with cream. "This was food for officers in Germany, not common soldiers," wrote Obergefreiter Wilhelm Becker of the 21st Panzer Division in his food diary. "Yet here, even we prisoners received it." The German prisoners watched in stunned disbelief as American merchant sailors consumed meals that would have been considered extravagant feasts back home. Steak, eggs, fresh vegetables, and most astonishingly of all, ice cream. Ice cream, a delicacy that in Germany had been reserved exclusively for the highest party officials, served casually to ordinary sailors as if it were nothing special at all. "As our ship approached the American coast," wrote Lieutenant Heinrich Wöber, whose Prussian military family had served Germany since the time of Frederick the Great, "I watched sailors disposing of barely touched meals, complete dinners going overboard. I thought of my men in Africa, grateful for a handful of dates and brackish water, and I began to understand that we had been fighting not just an enemy, but an entire civilization beyond our comprehension." Landing in America, August 1943. When they finally disembarked at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia in August 1943, the German prisoners experienced their first meal on American soil. What they were served shattered the last remnants of their comfortable assumptions. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cornbread, apple pie, coffee with real sugar. Unteroffizier Johann Fischer, a baker's son from Munich, meticulously calculated in his diary that this single meal contained more meat than his entire family's monthly ration back in Germany. "The Americans apologized that the meal was simple because we had arrived unexpectedly," Fisher recorded in astonishment. "Apologized for food that German generals would have considered a feast." That moment revealed the depth of our delusion. But this was merely the beginning. The real psychological demolition, the true ideological earthquake, awaited them at the camps themselves. The train journey from Norfolk to the camps, scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and other states, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that, according to Nazi doctrine, simply could not exist. At every stop, they observed American railroad workers consuming meat sandwiches without a second thought, drinking bottles of Coca-Cola as if such luxuries were commonplace, smoking cigarettes with no concern for rationing. At a depot in Memphis, Tennessee, prisoners watched in stunned silence as a dining car was loaded with fresh provisions: sides of beef, crates of eggs, sacks of potatoes, boxes of fresh vegetables. The quantity loaded for one train exceeded what entire German divisions had received in a month in Africa, wrote Stabsgefreiter Rudolf Richter, an agricultural inspector from Westphalia, before his conscription. The amount of food transported daily on American railways could sustain all of Germany. I saw freight cars full of wheat, refrigerated cars carrying meat and milk, entire trains devoted to moving food. And this was just one day, on one railway line, in one corner of this vast country. The landscape itself seemed designed to mock everything they had believed about American weakness. Fields stretched to the horizon, endless oceans of corn and wheat that dwarfed anything they had known in Europe. Grain elevators rose like cathedrals of abundance along both banks of rivers, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, stared out the window with growing unease. "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition," he wrote in his diary, "in endless quantities, without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." Camp Hearn, Texas, June 1943. When the first German prisoners arrived at Camp Hearn in Texas in June 1943, they encountered a facility that had been constructed in a mere 4 months, a feat of organizational efficiency that would have been impossible in wartime Germany. The camp sprawled across 720 acres, housing between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known even as civilians back home. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat. Each building had been constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed in their entirety. Guard towers ringed the compound, yes, but the facilities themselves were cleaner and more comfortable than many German military installations. Most of the prisoners at Camp Hearn were non-commissioned officers, NCOS, in the Army or Air Force. According to the Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, NCOS could not be compelled to perform manual labor. This meant that the prisoners at Camp Hearn had extensive leisure time, which they devoted to recreational and educational programs. They organized classes on various topics: history, accounting, foreign languages. They played soccer on athletic fields. They made crafts, painted, read books from well-stocked libraries. There were weekly movies, musical concerts, and theatrical performances in theaters built by the inmates themselves. For a time, Hearn had one of the finest orchestras in the entire county because members of Rommel's band, along with musicians from Germany's leading orchestras, had been transferred there. But none of this, not the comfortable barracks, not the recreational facilities, not even the orchestra, would shake them as profoundly as what was about to happen. The moment of truth. In the barracks that first night, the conversations continued. The prisoners had arrived dusty and exhausted from their journey, but their pride remained intact. They had been fed during transit, yes, but they assumed that was temporary. a propaganda effort to impress them before conditions reverted to what prisoners of war should reasonably expect. "Tomorrow," announced an older sergeant with certainty, "tomorrow we will see the reality of American prison camps. Mark my words, the generous meals were for show. Now we will receive what prisoners truly deserve: basic rations, nothing more." A corporal from the Africa Corps laughed bitterly. "I heard they will feed us in this cafeteria they speak of, probably a trough where they slop food like we are animals. That is the American way. No dignity, no order, just crude efficiency." "Let them try," muttered another soldier. "We are German soldiers. We have survived North Africa. We have endured bombardment. We have marched through hell itself. We will maintain our dignity no matter what indignities these Americans attempt to impose upon us." The word cafeteria was still being used mockingly, pronounced with deliberate contempt. They could not imagine what it truly meant. They assumed it was some sort of mess tent or feeding station where prisoners would be herded through like cattle, receiving minimal sustenance with maximum humiliation. None of them, not the lieutenant from Hamburg, not the sergeant from Bavaria, not the young private from Bremen, could have possibly anticipated what awaited them the next morning. For behind those cafeteria doors, under bright electric lights that would seem to illuminate every shadow of their misconceptions, lay not humiliation, but revelation. They were about to confront a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat: that America's power was not just military, but agricultural, not just about guns and tanks, but about the simple, overwhelming ability to feed its people, and even its enemies, with an abundance they could not have imagined. The stage was set. The morning sun would rise over Camp Hearn, Texas, and with it would come a moment that would be seared into the memories of these men for the rest of their lives. A moment when pride would collide with reality in the most unexpected of places: a dining hall filled with more food than they had seen in years. The midday whistle blew across Camp Hearn on that sweltering Texas afternoon in June 1943, its sharp call cutting through the humid air. Guards moved through the barracks, calling the prisoners to assemble for their first official meal at the camp. Rows of weary Germans shuffled forward, boots scuffing against the gravel pathways that crisscrossed the compound. The sun glared overhead, merciless in its intensity, a heat that reminded the Africa Corps veterans of Tunisia, but with a suffocating humidity they had never experienced in the desert. They followed the line of men ahead of them, expecting some crude feeding arrangement, perhaps a pot of thin stew ladled into dented tin cups, maybe a slice of dry bread if they were fortunate. Their conversations were subdued, but laced with that persistent arrogance, that determination not to be impressed by anything American. "Whatever they show us," muttered a corporal from the 15th Panzer Division, "remember it is propaganda, a show. They want to break our spirit." An older Feldwebel nodded grimly. "Maintain dignity. That is what matters. Let them see that German soldiers cannot be bought with food." Yet, as they turned the corner past the administration building, their steps began to slow. Ahead of them stood a structure unlike anything they had anticipated. Not a tent, not a simple mess hall, but a substantial building with wide doors thrown open, electric lights blazing even in daylight. The prisoners approached hesitantly, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. And then those doors swung fully open, and the men at the front of the line simply stopped moving. Those behind them craned their necks to see what had caused the sudden halt. And one by one, as they caught sight of what lay beyond those doors, they too fell silent. The Hall of Abundance. Before them stretched a cafeteria that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The hall blazed with electric light, row upon row of fluorescent bulbs that transformed the interior into a space as bright as an operating theater. Rows of polished tables gleamed beneath those lights, their surfaces spotless, their order precise. But it was the serving line that stopped them cold. Along one entire side of the hall ran stainless steel counters that reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. Behind those counters, steam rose from massive pans of food, real food, hot food, more food than many of these men had seen in a single place since before the war. The sight was almost cinematic in its impact, overwhelming the senses in a way that no amount of Nazi propaganda had prepared them for. Beef stew bubbled in enormous pans, chunks of actual meat visible in rich brown gravy. Mountains of mashed potatoes sat in serving trays, butter melting in golden pools across their surfaces. Green beans glistened under the lamps, seasoned and steaming. Loaves of white bread, real white bread, not the dark sawdust loaves they had known in Germany, were stacked higher than a man's hand. And beyond the main courses lay what seemed like impossible luxuries. Cakes arranged in neat rows, their frosting gleaming. Pitchers of milk, actual fresh milk, gallons of it. Coffee urns that filled the air with an aroma so rich it made their mouths water involuntarily. Fresh fruit, apples, oranges, bananas, piled in bowls as if they were common as stones. The air itself carried an almost intoxicating richness. The warmth of roasted meat, the sweetness of baked goods, the sharp tang of coffee. For men who had subsisted on increasingly meager rations for months and sometimes years, the sensory assault was staggering. The silence of disbelief. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. A young corporal from Hamburg, barely 20 years old, whispered so quietly that only the man next to him could hear. Das ist für Gefangene? This is for prisoners? The question hung in the air, unanswered because no one could quite believe it. Their eyes darted from the food to the guards, half expecting laughter, waiting for someone to announce that this was a cruel joke, that this feast was meant for the American soldiers and the prisoners would be directed elsewhere. But the American guards simply gestured toward the serving line with impatient, businesslike efficiency. "Come on, move it along," one guard called out in English, his tone suggesting this was entirely routine, nothing remarkable at all. That casualness, that absolute ordinariness with which the Americans treated this cornucopia was perhaps the most devastating element of all. This wasn't staged. This wasn't propaganda. This was simply normal, an everyday occurrence, standard procedure. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt of the Afrika Korps, who had kept a meticulous diary throughout his captivity, wrote that night, "When I saw that cafeteria for the first time, I understood that we had lost the war not on the battlefield, but long before the first shot was fired. A nation that could feed its prisoners this way, casually, without ceremony, as if such abundance required no special effort, such a nation possessed resources we could never match." The contrast was devastating in its immediacy. Only months earlier, some of these same men had stood in Berlin's ration lines, waiting hours for a scrap of bread or a cup of thin turnip soup. In the final year of the war, German civilian rations had dropped to starvation levels, 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. German soldiers in the field had fared little better. The Afrika Korps had survived on canned sardines, hardtack, and whatever they could capture from British supply depots. By 1945, Wehrmacht rations had been cut so severely that soldiers joked bitterly about Hitler's victory diet. Now, as prisoners of war in captivity, they faced more food in a single glance than they had seen in weeks. The polished trays before them reflected not just steam and electric light, but an image of America itself. Industrial might translated into sustenance, power measured in calories and cups of milk. The system revealed. Behind the prisoners, a Luftwaffe sergeant clenched his jaw, unwilling to let his men see the awe in his face. But even his Prussian discipline faltered as the line moved forward, and American mess workers handed each prisoner a gleaming metal tray. What happened next would bewilder the Germans more profoundly than any weapon they had faced on the battlefield. There was no single pot from which food was dumped onto plates, no officer barking orders about portions, no rigid hierarchy determining who ate first or who received more. Instead, they witnessed an orderly flow that seemed to embody something fundamentally American, a kind of mechanized democracy that operated with assembly line precision. Each man walked forward, sliding his tray along a metal rail. At each station, he encountered servers who actually asked, what he wanted. A spoonful of potatoes, or would he prefer more? Beef stew or chicken? A slice of white bread, or would he like cornbread instead? Butter or jam? Coffee or milk? The rhythm was mechanical, yet strangely democratic. A production line of nourishment where each man became his own master, making choices that had been denied to them for years. One prisoner muttered in disbelief, his voice shaking, "Wir dürfen wählen? We may choose?" The American guard simply nodded as if the question itself was strange. "Yeah, take what you want," he said in English, his tone suggesting this was the most natural thing in the world. Another POW whispered urgently to his comrade, "We amerikanische Soldaten? Like American soldiers?" The idea struck them with the force of a revelation. Choice, the fundamental freedom to select what you would eat. It was a privilege they had not imagined would be extended to prisoners of war. In the Wehrmacht, rations had been handed down without question. You ate what was given to you. No discussion, no alternatives. The officer corps received better food than enlisted men, and everyone accepted this as natural and proper, the physical manifestation of military hierarchy. Here, in captivity on enemy soil, they were suddenly confronted with the freedom to decide: cornbread or biscuits, carrots or green beans, coffee with sugar or without. Some hesitated, as if reaching for too much might spring some invisible trap. A few looked back nervously at their comrades before scooping gravy onto their plates, seeking permission from old hierarchies that no longer applied. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker recorded in his food diary, "The American system confused us more than their military tactics ever had. There were no officers eating first, no careful distribution according to rank. Each man, from the youngest Gefreiter to the oldest Feldwebel, received the same treatment, made the same choices. It was democracy translated into food, and it shook us to our core." As the line moved forward, hesitation gradually gave way to something between wonder and shame. Trays filled with food that was not just adequate but abundant, steaming and colorful, as though the very concept of hunger had been banished from this strange American hall. The irony was brutal in its simplicity. Back home in Germany, families in Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden survived on meager slices of bread that was more sawdust than wheat. Children shared watery soup made from turnips and potato peels. Mothers traded jewelry and family heirlooms for a few eggs or a pound of butter. Yet here, the defeated enemy could select between options, could exercise choice, could act with a degree of autonomy that German civilians had not known in years. The cafeteria embodied something they had not been prepared for: abundance linked intrinsically with liberty. Each tray was a silent lecture, a demonstration that in America even prisoners could exercise dignity through choice. It was democracy in its most basic form, not speeches or banners or political theory, but the simple, profound freedom to choose what would fill your stomach. And it was a weapon without gunpowder, no less devastating than artillery. The first bites. As they sat down at the long tables, forks clattering against metal trays, the POWs glanced at one another with expressions that mixed pride with disbelief, confusion with desperate hunger. The cafeteria filled with the sounds of eating, the scrape of utensils, the quiet murmur of German conversations, the occasional clink of cups being set down. Then the first bites were taken, and silence descended like a curtain. A private from Bremen, who had not tasted meat since the winter of 1944, closed his eyes as beef stew coated his tongue. The texture, the flavor, the richness of actual meat, not gristle or fat, but real beef, seemed almost obscene in its luxury. His throat tightened with emotion he could not name, gratitude, shame, anger, wonder, all tangled together. Another soldier, initially skeptical of the pale spread the Americans called peanut butter, dipped a corner of white bread into it, tasted cautiously, grimaced at the unfamiliar flavor, then, to his own surprise, reached for more. It was strange, unlike anything in German cuisine, but it was food, real food, and it was there for the taking. At one table, an Afrika Korps veteran stared at his tray for a long moment before eating, as if trying to reconcile what lay before him with everything he had believed about American weakness. He had fought at Kasserine Pass, where Rommel's forces had initially smashed through American positions in February 1943. That victory had seemed to confirm everything the propaganda had told them. Americans were soft, inexperienced, incapable of matching German military prowess. Yet now, sitting in this blazing cafeteria with more food on his tray than he had seen in months, he understood that Kasserine had been an illusion, a tactical victory that meant nothing against a nation with resources so vast they could feed even their enemies without strain. The initial sneers that had filled the barracks only hours earlier dissolved into focused, hurried chewing. Eyes darted around the room, prisoners watching each other, waiting to see who would admit it first, that this was better than anything they had eaten in years, perhaps better than anything they had ever eaten. Within minutes, the carefully maintained order began to break down. Men who had finished their portions rose awkwardly from their seats, trays still clutched in their hands, and drifted back toward the serving line. The guards looked on with faint amusement, as if they had seen this many times before and knew exactly what would happen. The same Germans who had laughed at American cafeterias that morning now returned for seconds. A Luftwaffe officer who had lectured his men about the superiority of German culture found himself standing in line again, unable to resist the pull of actual available food. He avoided eye contact with his subordinates, but they were too focused on their own trays to notice or to care. One sergeant who had once given elaborate speeches on the refinement of German dining now shoved cornbread into his mouth with boyish hunger, golden crumbs catching in his stubble. A young private licked frosting from his fingers with unabashed pleasure, whispering to his neighbor that it tasted sweeter than any ration his mother had managed to stretch across a month. The atmosphere in the cafeteria had shifted fundamentally. The first meal had been shock, the sudden confrontation with abundance beyond their imagination. The second helping became something else entirely, the surrender of pride. Each man who returned to that serving line was silently acknowledging a truth they had refused to accept, that America's power was real, tangible, and overwhelming. What the German prisoners did not know, what they could not have known, was the staggering scale of the agricultural machinery that had produced their meal. By 1944, American agriculture had reached unprecedented levels of production. The numbers were so enormous they defied comprehension for men who came from a continent ravaged by war and scarcity. In that single year, American farms produced over 24 billion pounds of meat, enough to provide every person in America with nearly 200 pounds annually. Flour mills churned out more than 120 million barrels of wheat, transforming amber waves of grain into bread, pasta, and pastries. Dairy farms produced over 117 billion pounds of milk, roughly 900 pounds for every American man, woman, and child. These numbers represented more than agricultural success. They demonstrated industrial organization on a scale that Europe had never achieved. Entire trains thundered across the Midwest, carrying milk, vegetables, and sugar. Refrigerated cars moved meat from slaughterhouses in Chicago to ports on both coasts. The logistics network that sustained this abundance was itself a weapon, a demonstration of organizational capacity that no enemy could match. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps had perfected a system that no army in history had ever equaled. They could supply not just American soldiers on 3 continents, but also millions of Allied troops and even enemy prisoners held in camps across the United States. In 1944 alone, the Quartermaster Corps distributed rations to over 12 million people daily: soldiers, sailors, airmen, prisoners, and civilian employees. The scale was breathtaking. 3 billion pounds of canned goods, 500 million pounds of coffee, 2 billion pounds of sugar. The revelation spreads. That night in the barracks at Camp Hearn, the men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices as if afraid the abundance they had witnessed might somehow be taken away. "Did you see how much food they simply threw away?" asked a corporal, his voice filled with something between outrage and awe. "An American soldier didn't finish his potatoes, and they scraped an entire plate into the garbage. Enough food for a family dinner in Germany, just discarded." Another prisoner, an agricultural specialist before the war, shook his head slowly. "The waste isn't cruelty. It's surplus. They have so much that they can afford to throw away what we would consider precious. That's the difference. That's what we were fighting against." The conversations were punctuated by long silences, men staring at the ceiling or at their hands, processing what they had experienced. Their worldview, carefully constructed through years of Nazi propaganda, was crumbling with each memory of that cafeteria, each recollection of steam rising from trays, each mental image of food stacked impossibly high. A Feldwebel, who had served since 1939, spoke quietly. "In Berlin, my wife stands in line for 3 hours to receive a single loaf of bread. My children have not seen fresh milk in 18 months. They eat soup made from potato peels. And here, we prisoners are asked if we prefer butter or jam, as if such choices were ordinary." His words hung in the darkness of the barracks, and no one contradicted him. By the second week at Camp Hearn, the cafeteria had become routine, but the psychological impact had not faded. Each day the prisoners filed through those doors, trays clattering, steam rising from the serving line, choices unfolding like a quiet parade of plenty. And each day another layer of their carefully constructed pride peeled away. The arrogance that had once wrapped their shoulders like an officer's cloak had thinned, thread by thread, until even the proudest among them stood quietly in line, eyes fixed on the abundance before them rather than on maintaining the illusion of superiority. One Luftwaffe captain, known throughout his unit for his clipped Prussian orders and disdainful gaze toward anything non-German, was spotted by his own men slipping back into the serving line for a second helping of roast beef. His subordinates watched in silence, a mixture of relief and discomfort settling in their eyes. No one mocked him. No one reported him to the senior officers. Hunger, and the availability of food to satisfy it, had united them more effectively than rank or Nazi ideology ever had. Another officer, a Hauptmann who had once delivered passionate lectures in the barracks about American vulgarity and the superiority of German culture, now balanced his tray with care, making sure not to spill the 2 slices of apple pie he had taken. Nobody mocked him either. The old hierarchies of judgment had dissolved in the face of simple, overwhelming abundance. But there was another dimension to the cafeteria experience that unsettled them even more deeply than the quantity of food. Behind the serving counters stood not just white American cooks, but African American mess workers, and sometimes even women in uniform, serving prisoners with matter-of-fact efficiency. They ladled stew, sliced bread, poured coffee, all without ceremony or commentary, treating the task as ordinary labor requiring no special attitude. For men who had been systematically fed Nazi propaganda about racial hierarchy for over a decade, the moment was profoundly shattering. To be handed food respectfully, or at minimum, neutrally, by someone whom Reich ideology had condemned as racially inferior, challenged the very foundations of everything they had been taught. Gefreiter Otto Schneider, a factory worker from Essen before his conscription, wrote in a letter that was intercepted by camp censors, "Today, a Negro handed me a plate of chicken and potatoes. He did not spit in it. He did not mock me. He simply served the food as he would to anyone. I had been told such people were subhuman, incapable of civilization. Yet here he stands in a clean uniform, doing his job with quiet competence, while I, a member of the master race, stand as a prisoner dependent on his labor. The contradiction is impossible to ignore." The whispers spread through the barracks that night, as they did every night. Some muttered shame, suddenly aware that their ideology had been built on lies. Others deflected, claiming it was just America's way and meant nothing. But the silence of the senior officers told its own story. They had no orders from Berlin to guide them through this particular challenge. No propaganda had prepared them for the cognitive dissonance of being treated with basic human decency by those they had been taught to despise. The cafeteria was not merely a place of abundance, it was a daily, unavoidable reminder that the world they had believed in, the carefully ordered hierarchy of race and nation that Nazi Germany had promised, was collapsing with every spoonful of stew, with every cup of coffee poured by hands of different colors. Statistics sharpened the humiliation for those prisoners who understood logistics and supply chains. At Camp Hearn alone, the cafeteria could serve 4,800 meals within a single hour, an industrial feat that required military precision combined with abundant resources. Records show that over 20,000 pounds of flour were baked into bread each week at just this one camp. Multiply that by the 511 POW camps scattered across the United States, and the numbers became astronomical. By the end of World War II, approximately 425,000 German and Italian POWs were held in American camps. Each prisoner received a daily caloric intake of approximately 4,000 calories, more than the average American civilian, and nearly 4 times what German civilians were receiving by 1945. The contrast was so stark it bordered on cruelty, though not the cruelty of deliberate deprivation. Rather, it was the cruelty of exposure, of forcing men to confront the vast gulf between what they had believed about their nation's strength and the reality of American productive capacity. Obergefreiter Johann Fischer, the baker's son from Munich who had meticulously tracked food consumption, calculated in his diary that the weekly food allocation for prisoners at Camp Hearn exceeded the monthly ration for an entire German neighborhood. "In the Schwabing district where I lived," he wrote, 2,000 families receive less food in 30 days than 4,000 prisoners receive here in 7. And this is supposed to be punishment, captivity, the wages of defeat. If this is how America treats its enemies, how must it treat its own? The psychological warfare, unintentional though it may have been, was devastatingly effective. American military planners had not designed the cafeteria system specifically to break German morale. They had simply followed the Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner treatment and applied American logistical efficiency to the problem of feeding large numbers of people. The psychological impact was almost a byproduct, but it proved more powerful than any propaganda campaign. Dr. Heinrich Weber, a Wehrmacht psychologist captured in France and held at Camp McCain in Mississippi, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The Americans defeated us psychologically not through cruelty, but through generosity, not through deprivation, but through abundance." Every meal was a demonstration of their power. Every choice we were offered was a lesson in their system. By feeding us so well, they showed us that they could afford to be merciful, and mercy from a position of such overwhelming strength is more devastating to pride than any torture could be. The prisoners began to understand that they had been fighting not just an army, but an entire economic system. The American industrial capacity that produced tanks and planes and ships also produced food in quantities that seemed to defy natural limits. They had been told America was weak, decadent, divided. Instead, they found a nation so strong it could feed millions, including its enemies, without apparent strain. The slow transformation. As weeks turned to months, the transformation deepened. The cafeteria became a gathering place where prisoners could almost forget they were captives. The food remained abundant, varied, and available. Ice cream was served regularly, a delicacy that shocked prisoners every single time, no matter how often it appeared. Gefreiter Hans Müller wrote to his mother, in a letter that camp censors allowed to pass, "Yesterday they served ice cream with chocolate sauce. I thought of you standing in line for black bread, and I wept into my dessert. The shame of eating so well while our families starve is almost unbearable. Yet when the meal comes, I eat. God forgive me, I eat." The guilt was a common thread in prisoner letters and diaries. Men who received packages from home containing pitiful rations that German families had saved, a few cookies, some hard candy, would stare at their care packages and then at the abundance of the cafeteria, unable to reconcile the two realities. But perhaps most remarkably, the cafeteria system began to change how the prisoners thought about democracy itself. The choice inherent in the serving line, the fundamental freedom to select what you would eat, became a daily lesson in American values. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker, who had been skeptical of democracy as a concept, wrote, "In Germany we were told that democracy was weak, that it led to chaos and inefficiency. Yet here I see democracy in action, and it is neither weak nor chaotic. Each man chooses his meal, and yet the line moves efficiently. There is no fighting, no hierarchy beyond basic courtesy. The system works because it respects individual choice while maintaining order. I begin to understand why they defeated us." The broader American abundance. The cafeteria was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a window into a broader American reality that prisoners glimpsed in countless ways. Prisoners who worked on nearby farms as part of labor details, those who were not NCOS and could be required to work under Geneva Convention rules, witnessed American agricultural abundance firsthand. They saw farmers with machinery that dwarfed anything in Germany, combines that could harvest in a day what would take a German farm a week. They watched as grain was harvested, stored in massive silos, and shipped in quantities that seemed incomprehensible. Gefreiter Karl Schmidt, the Bavarian farmer's son, worked on a cotton farm in Texas and wrote in his diary, The American farmer I work for has more land than my entire village combined. He owns 3 tractors. 3, when our whole region shares 1. His barn holds more feed than we see in a harvest season. And this is a modest farmer, he tells me. Not wealthy, just ordinary. If this is ordinary American agriculture, then we never had a chance of winning this war. The prisoners also observed American civilian life at a distance. When local townspeople came to watch the prisoners play soccer or attend their concerts, which they did regularly, the German POWs at many camps, became a source of local entertainment. The prisoners could see their clothing, their cars, their general appearance of health and prosperity. The American civilians we see are well-fed, well-dressed, and carefree, wrote Obergefreiter Rudolf Richter. They smile easily, laugh often. Their children are plump and energetic. This is a nation that has been at war for years, yet shows no signs of deprivation. Meanwhile, I think of Berlin, of Hamburg, of Munich, cities reduced to rubble, people reduced to scavenging. The contrast is devastating. The Coca-Cola incident. One incident at Camp Hearn became legendary among the prisoners and was retold for years afterward. In August 1943, the camp administration introduced Coca-Cola to the canteen, where prisoners could purchase small items with the scrip they earned from work details. For most of the German prisoners, this was their first encounter with the beverage. The initial reaction was skepticism and even mockery. "It looks like medicine," one prisoner complained. "It tastes too sweet," said another. But within days, there was a line at the canteen every time Coca-Cola was available. What affected them was not just the taste, but what the drink represented. Here was a beverage, a luxury item, essentially sweetened water with no nutritional value, produced in such quantities that even prisoners of war could purchase it casually. The wastefulness of it, the sheer excess, the fact that American industrial capacity was devoted to producing something so frivolous, demonstrated a level of abundance that was almost incomprehensible. Lieutenant Heinrich Föber, the Prussian officer whose family had served Germany for generations, wrote in his diary, "Today I bought a Coca-Cola with my canteen scrip. As I drank it, I realized that this single bottle, this unnecessary luxury, represents everything we were fighting against and everything we lost. America has so much that it can devote factories to producing beverages for pleasure. We in Germany devoted everything to producing weapons, and still we lost. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. A nation wealthy enough to be frivolous is stronger than a nation that must be serious about everything." The question of race and humanity. The encounter with African American service members and workers continued to challenge the prisoners' worldview throughout their captivity. Some prisoners, particularly younger ones who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi racial theory, struggled to reconcile what they had been taught with what they observed. Others, especially older prisoners who remembered pre-Nazi Germany, quietly questioned whether they had been lied to about many things, not just about America's military and economic strength. There were incidents of prisoners refusing to be served by black mess workers, particularly in the early days of captivity. But camp commanders dealt with such refusals pragmatically. Prisoners who refused to be served were free to go hungry. The policy was simple and effective. Hunger proved a powerful teacher of tolerance. Over time, relationships developed between prisoners and their African American guards and service workers, not friendships exactly, but a kind of mutual respect born of daily interaction. Prisoners learned the names of the men who served their food. Greetings were exchanged, small courtesies observed. Gefreiter Otto Schneider, the factory worker from Essen, wrote in a letter that was allowed to pass through censorship, "I have learned that human decency has nothing to do with race and everything to do with character. The Americans showed me this, intentionally or not. It is a lesson I will carry home, though I fear what speaking such truth aloud will cost me in the new Germany we must build. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the repatriation of German prisoners began, but it was a slow process. Many prisoners remained in American camps until 1946, and a few were not returned until 1947. This extended captivity meant prolonged exposure to American abundance, American democracy, and American values. The impact on their worldview was profound and lasting. Post-war studies of returning German POWs found that those who had been held in American camps were significantly more likely to support democratic reforms in Germany, more skeptical of authoritarian leadership, and more willing to acknowledge that Nazi ideology had been built on lies. The cafeteria had been an education in democracy more effective than any classroom lecture. Many prisoners returned to Germany and became advocates for rebuilding along democratic lines, explicitly citing their experiences in American POW camps as transformative. They spoke not of cruelty endured, but of abundance witnessed, not of humiliation suffered, but of choices offered. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Becker, the diary keeper who had tracked every meal, became a teacher in post-war Germany. In his classroom, he kept a photograph of the Camp Hearn cafeteria and would tell his students, "This is how America defeated us, not with bombs, though they had those in abundance, but with the simple demonstration that their system produced more, provided more, offered more to its people than ours ever could. Learn from this. Democracy is not weak. Abundance is not decadent. Freedom is not chaos. These are lies, we were told, and millions died because of those lies." The cafeteria as historical symbol. In the decades that followed World War II, the story of German POWs shocked by American cafeterias became a footnote in history, mentioned occasionally in memoirs, recorded in some academic studies, but largely overshadowed by the larger narratives of combat and strategy. Yet, for those who lived through it, the experience remained vivid and defining. Old men in Germany, decades removed from the war, would gather in beer gardens and speak less of Normandy or the Ardennes, and more of a cafeteria in Texas where the food never ran out and every man could choose his meal. Journalist Günther Stern, who interviewed dozens of former POWs in the 1970s for a documentary project, wrote, "When I asked about their most powerful memory of captivity in America, I expected stories of interrogation or homesickness. Instead, again and again, they spoke of food, of abundance, of the day they walked into a cafeteria and understood in a single moment of crystal clarity that the war had been lost before it began. That image, of steam rising from trays under electric lights, had branded itself into their memories more deeply than any battlefield trauma. The cafeteria had become a symbol, a physical manifestation of the difference between two systems, two philosophies, two ways of organizing human society. On one side, Nazi Germany, with its rigid hierarchies, its cult of sacrifice, its propaganda of superiority masking increasing desperation and scarcity. On the other, America, with its democratic chaos, its material abundance, its casual power expressed in the simple ability to feed everyone, even enemies, without apparent effort. The weapon of peace. In the final analysis, the American cafeteria system represented something more profound than psychological warfare or accidental propaganda. It represented the weapon that would ultimately win not just World War II, but the Cold War that followed. The demonstration that democratic capitalism, for all its flaws and contradictions, could deliver material abundance to ordinary people in ways that authoritarian systems could not match. The Soviet Union would learn this lesson more slowly than Nazi Germany had, but it would learn it nonetheless. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, interviews with East Germans who crossed into the West revealed the same shock, the same disbelief at the abundance of ordinary stores, the same revelation that they had been lied to about the comparative poverty of democratic systems. The pattern was consistent. Authoritarian regimes could demand sacrifice, could organize military power, could achieve impressive feats through forced mobilization. But they could not, in the long run, compete with systems that unleashed individual initiative, rewarded innovation, and produced abundance rather than merely redistributing scarcity. The German prisoners who walked into that cafeteria in June 1943 were witnessing the first act of a drama that would play out across the remainder of the 20th century. They were the first to learn the lesson that would eventually reshape the world, that nations which can afford to be generous, which can feed even their enemies without strain, which can offer choices rather than impose orders, possess a kind of power that military force alone can never match. Epilogue. The Taste of Memory. Hans Schmidt, the Africa Corps veteran who had kept such detailed diaries, returned to Germany in 1946. He lived until 2012, dying at the age of 92 in a small apartment in Hamburg. Among his possessions, his grandchildren found dozens of notebooks documenting his years as a POW. But they also found something else, a faded, carefully preserved photograph of the Camp Hearn cafeteria, taken by an American guard and given to prisoners as a souvenir. On the back, in Schmidt's handwriting, was a single sentence: "The day I understood we had lost." When interviewed by historians in 2008, Schmidt, then 88 years old, could still describe that first cafeteria meal in perfect detail. "I can still smell the beef stew," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of memory. "I can still see the steam rising under those lights. I can still feel the weight of that tray in my hands, heavier than any weapon I carried in the war, because it was weighted with the truth we had tried to deny, that we had been fighting against something too vast to defeat." He paused, staring at his hands, hands that had once held rifles and now trembled with age. "Sometimes," he continued, "I wonder if the Americans knew what they were doing, if they understood that every meal was a weapon more powerful than bombs. But I think they didn't. I think they were just being American, practical, efficient, abundant. And that, perhaps, was the most devastating thing of all. They defeated us without even trying, just by being themselves." History often teaches its lessons through grand gestures, declarations of war, peace treaties, momentous battles. But sometimes the most profound lessons come in smaller moments, in unexpected places. For thousands of German prisoners in World War II, that moment came not on a battlefield, but in a cafeteria. It came in the clatter of trays sliding along rails, in the steam rising from pans of food, in the simple question, "What would you like?" It came in the revelation that power is not always expressed through violence, that victory can be demonstrated through generosity, and that to nourish, to sustain, to provide, to offer abundance without fear of scarcity, is perhaps the most fundamental form of strength a civilization can possess. The prisoners who mocked American cafeterias in June 1945 learned this lesson with their bodies, their stomachs, their slowly transforming hearts. They learned it with every second helping, with every choice offered, with every meal that demonstrated what they had been fighting against. And in learning it, they carried a truth back to Germany that would help reshape that nation and, eventually, help reshape the world. That the future belonged not to those who could demand the most sacrifice, but to those who could deliver the most abundance. Not to those who could enforce the strictest order, but to those who could allow the greatest freedom. Not to those who glorified suffering, but to those who casually, almost carelessly, eliminated it. The cafeteria doors had opened on a summer day in Texas, and in walking through them, German prisoners had walked into a future they had tried to prevent and ultimately helped to build. That is the strange irony of history, that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not weapons at all, but simply the demonstration of how life can be lived when freedom and abundance work together. Sometimes the most devastating victory comes not from what you take from your enemy, but from what you give them. And sometimes the revolution begins not with a gunshot, but with a tray of food, warm and abundant, offered to men who had expected cruelty and found instead a glimpse of what their own future could become.